The age of empire is over. The monarchy wasn't built for what came next. So what is it now? And how is it still standing? The system it operates in now doesn't reward distance like it used to. It rewards attention. For most of its existence, the British monarchy survived by controlling distance and by staying just far enough removed to feel symbolic, stable, and nearly untouchable. But that logic doesn't translate cleanly into a world where visibility is constant and demanded and silence gets filled instantly. This is brand damage. A lot has been said about modernizing the monarchy or slimming it down as if this is just a question of scale or optics. It's not at all about that. What's actually under pressure here is communication. It's how the monarchy explains itself, or more accurately, how it doesn't. That's precisely where things start to get unstable. See, what the public now demands in exchange for loyalty, namely visibility, responsiveness, and some sense of accountability, are also the things that risk changing the monarchy into something else entirely, something flatter and more ordinary, and most significantly, a lot less powerful than what it was built to be. The British royal family is walking a fine line between meeting the demands of cultural relevance and visibility while also maintaining enough distance and magic to still remain the historical, cultural institution that they've always been. On one side, they have to meet the demands of cultural relevance. They have to be seen, understood, and legible to a modern audience. On the other, they still need to maintain enough distance, enough mystique, and enough separation to function as a historical and symbolic institution. And those two pressures don't resolve neatly. Push too far toward visibility, and they start to look like any other public figures. Another group of internet personalities, just with better titles and worse constraints. But stay too distant, and they lose control of the narrative completely, because the internet will simply fill in the gaps, whether they participate or not. And increasingly, it does, which means the strategy that carried them through decades, centuries even, never complain, never explain, which served them extremely well in the past, is now becoming a death knell in a culture that demands visibility and explanation. In a culture that expects explanation, refusing to engage doesn't always preserve authority. It sometimes creates a vacuum, and that vacuum doesn't stay empty for long. For centuries, the monarchy operated on a system of inherited authority. It passed from one generation to the next, father to son, mother to heir, anchored in the idea that legitimacy didn't need to be earned in real time. It simply existed, and people organized themselves around it. They have shifted now into a framework that we can describe as managed relevance. Similarly, they have moved from being a symbol following the end of the age of empire into becoming carefully controlled content that people consume. And that's not to say that they aren't still a symbol, as their role is still largely symbolic and ceremonial, but they've moved from being a distant and institutional symbol to becoming something more like managed and curated content that behaves symbolically. And that's a significant shift. It changes the job. The monarchy is no longer just there to represent the identity of a nation. It has to continuously translate that identity into something people can see, interpret, and react to in real time. They're not just operating in a framework of existing to represent the soul and identity of a nation, but now they're having to express that soul and identity through what is essentially content. And that introduces a tension that didn't exist in the same way before. They still need to maintain a sense of distance, a certain level of mystique. Otherwise, the whole thing collapses into something far more ordinary. But if that distance becomes too rigid, too unresponsive, it starts to feel outdated and disconnected. That's a difficult line to hold, especially in an environment where attention moves quickly and patience runs out even faster. So this raises a more fundamental question. Can an institution built on distance survive proximity? The more the monarchy is seen, the less it starts to resemble what it was built to be. For most of its history, the monarchy existed slightly outside of ordinary life, not completely removed, but elevated, something people looked toward rather than directly into. It held its shape through that distance. It felt stable over time, less tied to any single moment and bigger than the individuals inside it. Once you pull that institution into the same environment as everything else, into the internet, into the content cycle, into a space where everything is immediate and constantly interpreted, it starts to behave differently, and it starts to become something that feels very much closer. There's a very real argument that this is necessary. that visibility and accessibility are what keep the monarchy connected to the public in the first place. And to a point, that's true. They can't remain completely out of reach and expect people to stay invested. But there's a threshold where that shift stops helping and starts changing the nature of the thing itself. When everything is made visible, explained, and translated into something instantly understandable, the monarchy stops feeling elevated and starts to feel, dare I say, common, less like a symbol and more like something you watch, interpret in real time, and evaluate alongside everything else competing for attention. At that point, it's operating under a completely different set of expectations, closer to a public-facing personality than a symbolic institution, which is a difficult position to hold when your value depends on being something more than personality. So the question isn't whether they should be more visible. That shift has already happened. The real question is how much proximity the institution can absorb before it loops back around into being irrelevant. So let's talk about the structural reality of the monarchy, because as I said, a lot has been said about slimming down the monarchy, whether that be from King Charles himself or from various pundits, influencers, and commentators around the internet. The problem that the monarchy is having is not that it's bloated. In fact, it's actually quite brittle and dangerously concentrated. The current functional reality is this. You have King Charles, who has limited runway, who has health issues, and who is already elderly. Then you have Queen Camilla, who is also elderly and who has also been struggling with health issues such that she has a limited capacity to carry the monarchy on her back as well. Then you have Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, and these two are carrying the entire institution almost entirely by themselves. And they have also already been beset by Catherine having severe health issues, so they're already under strain. They're obviously the future of the monarchy, but by themselves they cannot represent the entire institution without some foundational help. And who is that foundational help? Well, you have Princess Anne, who has been carrying that responsibility for decades and is now reaching the point where that pace isn't sustainable forever. And you have Prince Edward and Sophie, and they are also already operating at the edge of what they can realistically take on. Outside of that, everybody else is either a child or a young adult entering adulthood, many of whom are very likely going to choose to have a private life. Or they are pretty much either extremely elderly and unavailable or completely unusable for other scandal-related reasons. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor is radioactive, and unfortunately for his two daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, they have been at least temporarily tainted by association, so any thought of them becoming full-time working royals is now off the table. And then lastly, of course, you have Harry and Meghan, who have chosen to leave the royal family and have chosen to do their own thing, whether that's podcasting or Netflix or selling jam and what have you, but they've also done that in a way that has created an enormous rift within the family, which means that their path back into the family as working royals is all but non-existent. So the firm can't really meaningfully slim down any further, and that forces narrative, optics, and communication to compensate for those structural limitations. The institution must present itself in a way so as to make that narrow base feel like something much broader and more stable than it actually is. Communications becomes a foundational part of how the structure holds. And that structural pressure doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's being pushed from both sides at the same time. Internally, the institution is already constrained, and as we've pointed out, there are people who are no longer usable in any public-facing capacity regardless of what the structure might need. The Yorks, obviously, and Meghan and Harry. And what happened with Meghan and Harry was interesting because Meghan clearly wanted to modernize the monarchy from day one, but she introduced something that wasn't actually helpful, which is narrative instability. And in her quest to constantly tell her truth or speak truth to power and revamp an entire centuries old institution that she didn't really know anything about, she actually added an element of instability that also created a very different threat to the monarchy, because she started veering too far into the other direction. So the monarchy is struggling with the outdated communication principle of never complaining and never explaining and just existing above all of the noise. And Meghan came in and wanted to completely change everything into a narrative exposition on every little thing that was ever said about anybody, particularly her. And that is also not helpful. And Harry went along with this for his own reasons, which we will discuss later. But the modern public does demand a response, and that creates a bit of a pressure system for the royal family, whose response has always been to not respond. In the current age of information and the proliferation of everybody's thoughts and feelings on the internet, the idea that you're simply not going to respond to a public that demands a response is untenable for future survival. Yet when every claim is addressed, when every perception is corrected in real time, when personal experience becomes something that is continuously explained and reframed in public, the narrative stops feeling controlled and starts to feel contested. Too little response, and the narrative runs away from them. Too much, and they lose control of the narrative entirely. That's where the real tension starts to build. In the old model of communication, authority was assumed, and so never complain and never explain also sustained the precedent that the institution would never or rarely be questioned. But in the new model, legitimacy must continually be maintained, and that requires responding to certain things while knowing when to stay silent on other things. That means the answer is not to respond to every little thing and to completely abandon any sense of discretion, but it does mean that the public is now asking, what are you going to do about this? And sometimes you have to answer the question, even if it is uncomfortable to your centuries-old sensibilities, even when it would be more comfortable for the institution to ignore it, even when responding feels like it pulls them down into a level of discourse they were never meant to occupy. Otherwise, that vacuum of silence is going to be filled largely by whatever voice on the internet happens to be the loudest or the fastest or holds the most confidence, regardless of whether they're right. And once that version of events takes hold, it becomes much harder to correct. So the challenge now isn't deciding whether to respond at all. It's knowing when a response is necessary and when restraint still serves a purpose. That balance didn't used to be part of the job as much, but now it is. Now, never complain, never explain was nothing other than pure functionality for the time that it worked in. And it worked within the system the monarchy existed in at the time. It worked because media was slower and information was centralized and slow to be circulated, and authority was rarely challenged in real time. There was a limit to how far it could go. So a newspaper would print something and people would talk about it, and it would just take longer to circulate. And more critically, there was no comment section. So everybody's personal thoughts and feelings about whatever was in the newspaper was not suddenly featured in the town square for debate and discussion and dissection. There was no constant stream of reaction, no public forum where every interpretation, every opinion, every accusation was immediately amplified and debated in real time. Silence had a stabilizing effect, prevented escalation, and allowed things to settle. It kept the institution from being pulled into every passing controversy. Unfortunately, now silence does the exact opposite. Rather than creating stability, silence creates a vacuum, and that vacuum is immediately filled by speculation. It is filled by social media narratives and opinions of varying credibility and fast spreading digital first commentary. This is in a system where the first narrative to spread becomes the default truth. So whoever is first and whoever is loudest is often simply regarded as correct, even if they're not, and they often are not. And so what used to give the royal family a modicum of control over the narrative now fuels their total loss of control over the narrative. Because everything from reasonable takes to Republican anti-monarchy talking points to fully unhinged conspiracy theories all has access to the same microphone. So what once protected the monarchy now exposes it. Silence used to read as discipline, as restraint, as a kind of quiet authority that didn't need to explain itself. That interpretation doesn't really hold anymore. Now when there's no response, people don't assume dignity, they assume something else is going on. It can come across as avoidance, like the institution is deliberately sidestepping the issue. In other cases, it reads as guilt, as if there's something to hide or something that can't be addressed directly. And at its worst, it starts to look like incompetence, not control, not strategy, just an inability to respond in a meaningful and authoritative way. Monarchy is all about authority. So this is where the monarchy starts to adjust, not by abandoning its core identity early, but by experimenting with how it presents itself. They're producing content now, carefully controlled, highly structured, and designed to increase visibility without giving up too much ground. And what's interesting is that you're not really supposed to feel the mechanics of that. It's meant to look natural and effortless and like you're just being given a small, authentic window into their lives. You can see this most clearly in how Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, are showing up online. The videos are polished, there's a clear narrative arc. You'll hear Catherine's voice layered over carefully selected footage, everything edited to feel intimate without actually being unstructured. It invites you in just enough, but it never really lets go of control. And that balance is deliberate, and more importantly, it is correct from a brand perspective. And the royal family is not just a family, not just a symbol, but a prestige brand. It gives the impression of access while maintaining distance. It feels more personal than what came before, but it's still operating within very tight boundaries. To their credit, they've managed this very well. It still carries that aspirational quality, not superiority, not entitlement, but still a sense that this exists slightly above the level of everyday life. And that's important because if that disappears completely, the whole thing starts to flatten. So, what you're seeing isn't modernization in the sense of a natural evolution, like they've suddenly decided to become fully transparent, fully accessible, fully embedded in the same ecosystem as everyone else. Heaven forbid. It's more constrained and more calculated than that. This is adaptation under pressure. Someone, somewhere in that system, recognized that continuing exactly as they had been wasn't going to hold and that some level of visibility had become necessary. And so now you have a version of the monarchy that is actively shaping how it appears in real time. Something that would have been almost unthinkable under the older model. They're still doing the engagements, still managing the structure, but now there's an additional layer running alongside it, one that's designed to keep them legible, relevant, and present in a space that doesn't wait for them anymore. This shift isn't really happening by choice. It might look like a gradual modernization from the outside, like they've decided to evolve, to become more visible, to engage a little more directly with the world around them, but that's not quite what's driving it. What's actually happening is response to pressure. They're being pulled into visibility by a system that doesn't tolerate absence very well. When they step back, when they go quiet, when they try to maintain that older distance, something else moves in. Other voices fill the space. Other interpretations take hold, and those interpretations don't wait for confirmation. So remaining silent doesn't preserve control in the way it once did. Rather, it hands that control off to outside voices and influences. That dramatically changes the calculation. Now, visibility isn't just a strategic choice, it's something they have to manage whether they fully want to or not. The fact is that the environment they're operating in rewards presence but penalizes anything that looks like withdrawal. But as we've said, there's a limit to how far they can push in that direction, because if they move too far into that space, if everything becomes visible, accessible, constantly explained, the nature of the institution starts to shift. It stops feeling like something symbolic and starts to feel like something performative, something you might follow or react to, something that lives in the same ecosystem as influencers and celebrities. And that's where the risk really is. Not that they become more visible, but that they become legible in the wrong way. And once that shift happens, the things that give the monarchy its weight start to erode. That sense of mystique fades. The authority that comes from distance weakens, and the symbolic power that holds the whole thing together becomes much harder to sustain. So, how does this contrast with previous efforts to modernize the monarchy, as they say? Well, when Meghan Markle came into the family, that was her primary goal, and she pretty much said as much. And the real conflict with Meghan was not personal when it comes to the firm. The real conflict with Meghan was American celebrity culture versus British institutional culture. In Meghan's model, visibility is the source of power. Narrative ownership is critical and needs to be enforced across every possible iota of information online. Emotional expression is important to build what she likes to call authenticity and relatability. And critically, one's personality is essentially the brand. All of this is very fast and high risk and individual first thinking. And that is what we see a lot of in American culture around celebrities. But the monarchy's model relied on distance to maintain authority and silence to maintain control. The identity of the institution isn't built around personality, it's built around continuity. Beyond that, it was a lot less individualistic. The role was more important than any particular individual inhabiting it, and the symbol that each individual member represented and that the monarchy as a whole represented was always much more important than any single personality. The symbol was the brand, not the queen's personality or the king's personality or anybody else's. This represents a slow and controlled institution first methodology. So let's give Meghan some credit here because she correctly identified the problem, but unfortunately for everyone, she applied a model that would have destroyed the institution. And that is really where the tension with Meghan and the rest of the family came from before you get into all of the other accusations and interviews and drama that ended up happening, because all of that really happened because of this first. It happened because she tried to take the reins and would have driven the entire institution right off a cliff while screaming about authenticity on the way down, and they wouldn't let her do it. And to be fair to Harry for a moment, his frustration with what he's described as the men in gray suits, the institutional gatekeeping and rigid control behind the scenes, was not entirely unfounded. The problem is that his and Meghan's solution, namely full narrative exposure, constant response, and pulling the institution into the same reactive cycle as everything else, would have done permanent damage. Full adoption of celebrity logic would have reduced the monarchy to something disposable. The family didn't reject modernization as a whole. They rejected a version that would have required them to become something entirely different from what they are and would have ultimately destroyed them outright. There's an irony in how this has all played out. The monarchy rejected a faster, more expressive style of visibility, the kind that centers the individual, moves quickly, and responds in real time, and yet they're now moving toward visibility anyway, just on their own terms. Slower, more controlled, more deliberate in how it's constructed and released. So the shift is happening, but the model that Meghan tried to push on them, faster, more reactive, driven by narrative, operates on a completely different timeline. It prioritizes speed and rewards immediacy. It assumes that if something is being said about you, you respond quickly enough to shape how that story develops. That can work in environments where the individual is the center of the system, although it can often backfire spectacularly. But the monarchy can't operate that way. Everything they do has to pass through a different set of constraints. It has to preserve legitimacy. It has to maintain continuity. It has to consider not just the immediate moment, but how that moment fits into a much longer timeline. And that slows everything down. So now you have an institution competing in an environment that rewards speed while being structurally incapable of moving at that speed without undermining itself. That's the tension. Move too slowly and the narrative outruns them. Move too quickly and they start to compromise the very qualities that justify their existence in the first place. There isn't an obvious way to resolve that. One of the cleanest examples of how the system works right now is Catherine, Princess of Wales. She plays a very specific role within the structure. She stabilizes perception. She absorbs an enormous amount of public goodwill, and she manages to maintain that difficult balance, being relatable enough for people to feel connected to her while still preserving a sense of distance that keeps the role intact. That balance is not easy to hold, but it's become essential, which means her presence carries more weight than it used to. And when that presence disappears, even for completely legitimate reasons, the system reacts. So when she was absent during her cancer treatment, it caused immediate instability, and it created a conspiracy vacuum where people immediately jumped online to discuss whether or not she was sick and whether or not she was even still alive. And the reason for that is that the system, in the current age of information, no longer tolerates unexplained absence. And not only does it not tolerate unexplained absence, but even when the absence is explained, the system still requires updates. There's an expectation now that explanation will be followed by continued visibility, some kind of update, some indication that things are progressing, that the situation is still being tracked in real time. And when that doesn't happen, the questions come back, often louder, which creates a difficult reality because on a human level, stepping back to deal with something serious like that should be entirely unremarkable. It should be allowed and respected. But from the perspective of the monarchy as a brand, the longer that absence continues without visible reinforcement, the more unstable the perception becomes and the louder the silence gets. And meanwhile, in what is extremely good news for the future of the monarchy, Prince William apparently understands the need to modernize and has expressed as much. Critically, he also rejects the chaotic, more American model and has been signaling future strategy of essentially being firmer and employing a more controlled response to crises as they emerge. There's no indication that he's interested in moving toward a more reactive, personality driven model, one where every narrative is addressed in real time or the institution starts behaving like a participant in its own commentary cycle. And this is good news for the monarchy because it would appear that the days of never complain, never explain as infallible strategy will die with His Majesty the King, and that they won't be replaced with a completely unhinged and over the top new strategy that cheapens the monarchy by responding to every criticism and complaining about every error and devolving into actively involved tabloid fodder. Instead, he's signaling a willingness to step in when it's necessary, but without collapsing into a mode where everything becomes immediate, personal, and reactive. And that may end up defining the next phase of the monarchy's communication strategy, a shift away from complete non response without swinging all the way into overexposure, which is probably the only viable path forward. The alternative is easy to imagine: an institution that tries to answer everything, respond to everything, correct every narrative as it appears, and in doing so pulls itself into the same cycle it's supposed to sit above. That doesn't stabilize anything, it just accelerates the loss of distance. So if there is a future version of this that holds together, it likely looks something like this: more willing to engage, but still controlled enough to preserve the structure it depends on. He also seems to understand that content is now a necessary evil that the royal family will simply have to come to terms with, because they can't expand their roster, there are no more people, and they can't fully slim down because, again, there are no more people. And they can no longer rely on silence to bolster their authority because those days are simply over. So now they must actively maintain perception, and while it may be uncomfortable, they must allow the public in a little bit more while still maintaining enough distance to maintain their dignity and status as a cultural symbol of millennia old heritage. The old strategy of relying on silence to reinforce authority doesn't hold in the same way anymore, so something has to fill that gap. And increasingly, that something is controlled visibility, a way of actively maintaining perception rather than assuming it will hold on its own. That means letting the public in just enough for the institution to feel present, responsive, and legible, but not so much that it loses the distance that gives it meaning in the first place. It requires them to operate in a space they were never designed for, while still preserving the structure that they were built to maintain. There's also a more human constraint under all of this. The people inside the institution are still people. They're still human beings. They have limits. They have private lives. They still have things that should exist outside of public interpretation. And yet, the system they're now operating in doesn't naturally respect that boundary. So the solution can't be total openness, but it can't be total withdrawal either, which leaves them in a position where they have to actively manage how much access they allow, while knowing that either extreme comes with consequences. The monarchy has already been reduced to its essential core. What remains isn't excess, it's not too many people, and it's not spending too much money. It's simply exposure. And they are now operating in a system that no longer allows distance, so that exposure becomes an inherent risk. For the British monarchy, survival no longer depends on who they remove, but on how well the few who remain can maintain the illusion of something much larger, how effectively they can preserve the sense of scale, continuity, and meaning while operating under conditions that constantly threaten to flatten all of it into something ordinary. So the question isn't whether the monarchy will change, it already has. The question is whether it can evolve into a modern institution while preserving the thing that gives it meaning, or whether it's slowly dissolving into a highly curated version of irrelevance. I'm Christina Rapucci, and this is Brand Damage. God save the King.